Music. What if the answer to one of America's most haunting mysteries has been hiding in plain sight for nearly 3 decades, locked inside microscopic fragments of genetic material that science couldn't fully decode until now? December 26, 1996. Boulder, Colorado. A family reported a situation that would become one of the most analyzed cases in American forensic history. What began as a reported kidnapping transformed into a death investigation that has remained unsolved for nearly 3 decades. And at the center of it all lies a piece of evidence that refuses to be ignored. DNA. Genetic material that doesn't match any known individual. DNA that was found in specific locations. DNA that has been examined using technology that didn't exist when it was first collected. DNA that, according to some forensic experts, strongly suggests certain interpretations about the case. DNA that, according to other experts, requires more context before conclusions can be drawn. Before we dive deep into the forensic evidence that has haunted investigators for 29 years, make sure you're subscribed to Coldcase Crimelab. Hit that like button if you're ready for a deep dive into the science that could finally crack this case. Turn on those notifications because we're analyzing evidence that challenges everything we thought we knew about DNA. We bring you in-depth analysis of forensic evidence, DNA testing methodology, and how advancing technology is providing new approaches to cold cases. This is the kind of investigation that keeps you up at night, and you won't want to miss a single detail. Music. This is the story of how DNA evidence was collected in 1996, how it was analyzed in 1997, how advanced testing occurred in 2008, and how genetic genealogy technology in 2025 might finally provide answers. This is about forensic science, about how DNA testing has evolved over 3 decades, and about how one case has challenged our understanding of what DNA evidence can and cannot tell us. This is about a mystery that has consumed investigators, forensic scientists, and the public for almost 30 years. This is about evidence that keeps speaking, even when no one has been able to fully understand its language. Until now. Music. The case involves a young individual from a prominent Boulder family. The family resided in a large residence with multiple floors, including a complex basement area. It was a home that seemed to represent the American dream. Success. Stability. Safety. But on one cold December morning, that illusion would be shattered in a way that would send shockwaves through the community and eventually through the entire nation. On the morning of December 26, 1996, at 5:52 a.m., a 911 call was placed reporting that an individual had been taken and a ransom note had been discovered. The voice on the other end of that call was frantic, desperate, terrified. The kind of call that law enforcement dreads receiving. The kind of call that sets into motion a massive response. The kind of call that changes everything. Music. The note, written on paper from a notepad found inside the residence, demanded a specific sum of money. But this wasn't just any ransom note. It was long. Unusually long. Multiple pages. Written with what appeared to be careful deliberation. It referenced specific details about the family. It mentioned exact amounts of money. It used language that seemed both calculated and theatrical. And it was written on materials found inside the home, using a pen found inside the home, suggesting that whoever wrote it had spent considerable time inside that residence. Law enforcement responded within minutes. Officers arrived at the scene prepared for a kidnapping scenario. The initial response followed standard protocols for such situations. The residence was secured. The family was interviewed. Friends and family members began arriving to provide support. The ransom note was photographed and analyzed. Investigators began the process of determining what had happened and what needed to happen next. During the initial hours, the residence was treated as a potential kidnapping scene. Multiple people were present in the home, including family members, friends who came to provide support, and law enforcement personnel. People moved through rooms. Conversations occurred in hallways. Support was offered in living spaces. The normal containment and preservation of a crime scene was compromised by the very nature of what everyone believed was happening. A child had been taken. A family was in crisis. Humanity and protocol collided in those early morning hours. Music. But then, at approximately 1:05 p.m., everything changed. The missing individual was located deceased in a basement room. Not taken from the home. Not held for ransom somewhere across town or across state lines. But there. In the basement. In a small room that had been in that house the entire time. The kidnapping scenario collapsed. The ransom note suddenly made no sense. And the investigation shifted from a race against time to save a life to a homicide investigation focused on finding who had taken that life. The case immediately transitioned to a criminal investigation involving a fatality. The scene had been compromised by the presence of multiple people during the preceding hours, a factor that would complicate evidence analysis for decades to come. Fingerprints had been layered upon fingerprints. Fibers had been transferred from person to person. DNA from family, friends, and first responders had been deposited throughout the scene. The preservation of evidence, which is critical in any criminal investigation, had been inadvertently undermined by the circumstances of those first crucial hours. Music. An autopsy was conducted on December 27, 1996, following standard forensic medical procedures. The examination determined the cause of death and documented various findings according to established protocols. The forensic pathologist conducted a thorough examination, collecting evidence, documenting injuries, establishing timelines based on physiological indicators. This examination would become one of the most scrutinized autopsies in American history, with every finding analyzed and debated by experts for years to come. The physical evidence collected during the autopsy and from the scene itself would form the foundation of the forensic investigation. Among the items collected were biological samples, trace evidence, fibers, hair, and genetic material that would eventually be tested for DNA. At the time, DNA testing was still relatively new in criminal investigations. The technology existed, but it was not as advanced or as sensitive as what would be available in later years. The samples collected in 1996 would be tested with the best available technology at that time, but they would be retested multiple times over the following decades as technology advanced. Music. The initial DNA testing occurred in 1997. Forensic scientists examined biological evidence collected from multiple locations. The testing revealed something significant. Genetic material that did not match the victim. Genetic material that did not match known family members. Genetic material that appeared to come from an unknown male individual. This DNA was found in specific locations that suggested, to some investigators and forensic experts, potential direct contact with the victim. The presence of unknown male DNA immediately raised critical questions. Who did this genetic material belong to? How did it get there? When did it get there? Was it related to the crime, or was it innocent transfer from some earlier, unrelated contact? These questions would dominate the investigation for years. They would divide expert opinions. They would fuel countless theories. And they would remain unanswered despite decades of investigation. Music. DNA evidence is powerful, but it requires context. The mere presence of DNA at a location does not automatically indicate involvement in a crime. DNA can be transferred through direct contact. It can be transferred through indirect contact, sometimes called secondary or tertiary transfer. It can persist on surfaces for extended periods. It can be deposited innocently and remain undetected until sophisticated testing reveals its presence. Understanding not just what DNA is present, but how it got there and when it got there, is critical to properly interpreting DNA evidence. In this case, the unknown male DNA was found in multiple locations. On clothing. On specific items associated with the victim. The DNA appeared consistently in testing, suggesting it was not simply random contamination. The quantity and location of the DNA suggested, to some experts, that it represented meaningful evidence. But to other experts, the possibility of innocent transfer could not be excluded, particularly given the compromised nature of the crime scene in those first critical hours. Music. As the investigation continued, the DNA evidence became a central focus. In 2003, the Boulder district attorney at that time stated that the DNA evidence was significant and represented a key piece of the investigative puzzle. The position taken by law enforcement and prosecution at various times reflected the belief that this DNA evidence pointed toward an unknown intruder, someone not previously identified or connected to the family. But not everyone agreed with that interpretation. Some forensic experts and investigators believed that the DNA evidence was being given too much weight without sufficient context. They pointed to the compromised crime scene. They noted the possibilities of innocent transfer. They emphasized that DNA evidence, while scientifically valid, requires careful interpretation within the broader context of all available evidence. The debate over how to interpret the DNA evidence created divisions within the investigative and forensic communities that persist to this day. Music. In 2008, a significant development occurred. The Boulder district attorney at that time ordered advanced DNA testing using touch DNA analysis. This technology was more sensitive than earlier testing methods. It could detect genetic material from skin cells left behind by simple touching. It could identify DNA from smaller samples than older methods required. The 2008 testing examined areas that had not been tested previously or that had been tested with less sensitive methods. The results of the 2008 testing appeared to support the earlier findings. Unknown male DNA was again detected. The genetic profile appeared consistent across multiple items. The district attorney at that time sent letters to the family members stating that the DNA evidence appeared to indicate that an unknown male individual was responsible and that the family members were considered excluded as suspects based on the DNA evidence. This was a significant public statement, representing an official position based on the interpretation of forensic evidence. Music. However, the 2008 testing and the conclusions drawn from it were not without controversy. Some forensic experts raised concerns about the interpretation of touch DNA evidence. Touch DNA can be incredibly sensitive, which is both a strength and a potential complication. It can detect genetic material from the most minimal contact. But that same sensitivity means it can also detect DNA that was transferred incidentally, sometimes through multiple intermediary contacts. A person can leave their DNA on an object. That object can then transfer that DNA to another object or person. The DNA can persist and be detected days, weeks, or even longer after the initial contact. The question that divided experts was this: did the DNA evidence represent genetic material deposited by someone who committed a crime, or did it represent genetic material that arrived through some innocent chain of events, perhaps even before the date of the crime? Without additional context, without a known source to compare it to, the DNA remained a mystery wrapped in scientific possibility. Music. As years turned into decades, the case remained unsolved. The DNA profile was entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database that allows law enforcement to compare DNA profiles from crime scenes with DNA profiles from convicted offenders and other crime scenes. Despite being in the database for years, the unknown male DNA profile never matched any known individual in the system. Whoever left that genetic material had never been arrested for a crime that required DNA collection, or had never been identified through any other investigation that resulted in their DNA profile being entered into the database. The lack of a match in CODIS was both frustrating and informative. It suggested that the source of the DNA was not someone with a criminal history, at least not one that had resulted in DNA collection. This fact was used to support different theories. Some believed it indicated an unknown intruder with no prior criminal record. Others believed it demonstrated that the DNA might be from someone who had innocent contact at some earlier time, someone who had no connection to the crime at all. Music. Then came a revolution in forensic genetic genealogy. In 2018, law enforcement successfully identified a suspect in a decades-old California case using DNA evidence and public genetic genealogy databases. The technique involved taking DNA from a crime scene, creating a genetic profile, and uploading it to public genealogy websites where people had voluntarily submitted their own
now a team
DNA
of experts are
to
going
learn
through
about
evidence
their
looking for
ancestry
answers
and
in the
find
case's
relatives.
remaining mysteries. ABC's
By
Alex Stone joins
identifying
me now
distant
for
genetic
more.
relatives
Alex, this
and
was a
then
case
building family
that
trees,
captivated the nation then
investigators could
and now.
narrow
Really, it's
down
captured the nation
potential
for decades because we
suspects.
never got an answer here. So,
This
what can you tell us
technique,
about
called
the
forensic
evidence
genetic
experts are sifting through now?
genealogy, represented a
this is mainly
paradigm
DNA
shift in
evidence,
cold
and its
case
DNA evidence has been known
investigation.
for a very long time. That was in
Suddenly,
JonBenet's underwear
DNA evidence
that
that had been sitting in databases for decades without matches could potentially be used to identify
but they have never been
suspects
able to
through their
identify
family
whose
connections.
DNA that was in her underwear. There
Cases
have been a
that
number of
seemed
people, John
permanently
Marcar, you may remember that
unsolvable
name,
began to
in
crack
2006 who have come forward claiming that they killed
Suspects
JonBenet
who had
Ramsey,
lived for
but it was a
decades
DNA
without
that then
facing
led police
justice
to
found
say
themselves
no, that they made
confronted
it
with
up. So
evidence
it's really
they never
looking at that
imagined
DNA,
could lead back
looking
to
at new
them.
technology, genealogy,
Music.
that has been used to
The success of forensic genetic genealogy in multiple cases created new hope for this investigation. If the unknown male DNA could be run through forensic genetic genealogy databases, it might be possible to identify the source through family tree research. The genetic material that had been tested and retested for decades might finally reveal its secrets, not through a direct match in a criminal database, but through the identification of genetic relatives who had voluntarily submitted their DNA to ancestry websites. In 2023, law enforcement agencies confirmed that they were pursuing forensic genetic genealogy as an investigative technique in this case. The DNA evidence that had been collected in 1996, tested in 1997, and retested in 2008 was now being approached with 21st-century technology. The same genetic material, examined through a completely new lens. The possibility of finally identifying the source of that DNA seemed more real than it had at any previous point in the investigation. Music. But forensic genetic genealogy is not a simple or quick process. It requires high-quality DNA samples. It requires the presence of genetic relatives in the databases. It requires skilled genealogists who can build accurate family trees spanning multiple generations. It requires investigators who can then take that genealogical information and narrow it down to specific individuals who could have been in the right place at the right time. And even when all of those elements come together successfully, it still requires traditional investigative work to confirm that the person identified through genetic genealogy is actually the source of the DNA. The process can take months or even years. In some cases, the DNA quality is insufficient for genealogical analysis. In other cases, the individual's family members simply aren't in the databases, making it impossible to identify them through family connections. And in still other cases, the genealogical research produces multiple possible candidates who must then be eliminated through traditional investigation until only one remains. Forensic genetic genealogy is powerful, but it is not magic. It is science combined with genealogical research combined with traditional police work. Music. As of 2025, the investigation continues. The DNA evidence remains the most significant forensic element of the case. Advanced testing continues to be conducted as technology improves. Forensic genetic genealogy efforts are ongoing. And investigators remain focused on the possibility that scientific advancement will provide the breakthrough that decades of traditional investigation has not produced. The case that began on December 26, 1996, continues to evolve as science evolves. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. And while you're at it, make sure you've hit that subscribe button for Coldcase Crimelab. We're committed to bringing you the most thorough analysis of forensic evidence and DNA technology in unsolved cases. This is where science meets justice, and you're part of this journey. Music. The evolution of DNA testing over the past 3 decades has been extraordinary. In 1996, DNA testing required relatively large samples and could only detect genetic material present in significant quantities. The technology was revolutionary for its time, but primitive by today's standards. Testing took weeks or months. Results were less specific than modern testing. And the ability to detect trace amounts of DNA was limited. By 1997, when the first DNA testing was conducted in this case, the technology had advanced but still had significant limitations. The testing could identify that unknown male DNA was present. It could determine that it didn't match known individuals. But the sensitivity and specificity were nowhere near what would be available just a few years later. Evidence that would yield detailed genetic profiles in 2008 might have yielded only partial profiles or no results at all in 1997. Music. The 2008 Touch DNA testing represented a quantum leap forward. Suddenly, investigators could detect genetic material from the simple act of touching an object. Skin cells that sloughed off during normal contact could be collected and analyzed. Items that had tested negative or inconclusive with earlier methods could now yield detailed genetic profiles. This increased sensitivity opened new investigative possibilities, but it also created new interpretive challenges. If testing was so sensitive that it could detect DNA from the most casual contact, how could investigators determine which DNA was relevant to the crime and which was innocent background? This question became central to debates about the DNA evidence in this case. The fact that more sensitive testing continued to detect the same unknown male DNA profile in multiple locations was seen by some as confirmation that the DNA was significant and crime-related. The consistency across different items and different testing methods suggested a pattern rather than random contamination. But others remained cautious, noting that sensitive testing could also consistently detect DNA that had been transferred innocently before the crime occurred. Music. The debate over DNA interpretation reflects a broader tension in forensic science. DNA testing itself is scientifically robust. The ability to identify genetic profiles is extraordinarily accurate. The chances of 2 unrelated individuals having the same DNA profile are astronomically small. DNA testing can conclusively determine whether genetic material came from a specific person. But the scientific certainty of the DNA testing itself does not automatically translate to certainty about how that DNA became relevant to an investigation. Consider a hypothetical scenario. A person shakes hands with someone at a public event. That handshake transfers skin cells containing DNA. Later that day, the person who received the handshake touches an object, transferring some of those skin cells to that object. Days later, that object is involved in a crime committed by someone else entirely. When the object is tested, it contains DNA from multiple people: the perpetrator, the person who touched it days earlier, and potentially the person whose DNA was transferred during the handshake days before that. Advanced DNA testing will detect all of those genetic profiles. But which one is relevant to the crime? Music. This is the interpretive challenge that makes DNA evidence both incredibly valuable and incredibly complex. In this case, the presence of unknown male DNA is a fact. The genetic profile exists. It has been detected consistently across multiple items and multiple testing methods over nearly 3 decades. But what that DNA represents, how it got there, and whether it is connected to the crime or is evidence of innocent contact from before the crime, remains a matter of interpretation and debate among experts. Some forensic scientists believe that the location and consistency of the DNA strongly suggests it is crime-related. They point to the fact that it was found on items in direct contact with the victim. They note that it has appeared consistently in testing over many years. They argue that the probability of such consistent detection from innocent transfer is low. They interpret the DNA evidence as pointing toward an unknown intruder who left genetic material during the commission of the crime. Music. Other forensic scientists urge more caution. They emphasize that the crime scene was compromised during the initial hours when multiple people were present. They note that the residence had been occupied and visited by numerous people in the days and weeks before the crime, any of whom could have left DNA that was later detected. They point out that touch DNA can persist for extended periods and can be transferred through intermediary objects. They argue that without knowing the source of the DNA and being able to establish when and how it was deposited, drawing conclusions about its relevance to the crime is premature. This division among experts is not about the science of DNA testing itself. Both groups agree that the DNA profile is accurate and reliable. The division is about interpretation. About context. About what the presence of that DNA actually means within the broader framework of the case. And without additional information, without identifying the source of the DNA and understanding their potential connection to the victim or the residence, that interpretive question may never be fully resolved. Music. The ransom note remains one of the most puzzling elements of the case. It was lengthy, running to multiple pages. It was written on paper taken from a notepad found inside the residence. It was written with a pen found inside the residence. It demanded a specific amount of money. It referenced details about the family. It used language that seemed both dramatic and calculated. And it was found in the residence where the victim was later discovered, making the entire kidnapping scenario it described nonsensical. Forensic document examiners analyzed the ransom note extensively. Handwriting analysis was conducted. Linguistic analysis examined word choice, phrasing, and style. The paper and ink were examined. Attempts were made to determine whether the handwriting matched family members or other known individuals. But handwriting analysis, unlike DNA testing, is not an exact science. Different examiners reached different conclusions. Some believed they could exclude certain individuals as the author. Others were less certain. The ransom note provided clues, but like so much else in this case, those clues were open to interpretation. Music. One significant aspect of the ransom note was the time it would have taken to write. Multiple pages of text, written with apparent care, would require considerable time. This suggested that whoever wrote it had spent a significant amount of time inside the residence, either before the crime or during it. If an intruder had entered the home and committed the crime, they had also apparently spent the time to sit down and compose a lengthy ransom note. This struck some investigators as unusual. Most intruders want to minimize time at a crime scene. Writing a multi-page note would extend exposure to the risk of being discovered. Others argued that the note could have been written before the crime, perhaps by someone who had been in the residence earlier for innocent reasons. The note could have been prepared in advance, explaining the time and care apparent in its composition. But this theory raised other questions. Why would someone prepare an elaborate ransom note for a crime that didn't actually involve a kidnapping? Why go to such lengths to create a false scenario? The ransom note created as many questions as it potentially answered. Music. The investigation over the years has involved literally thousands of investigative hours. Hundreds of people have been interviewed. Countless tips have been received and followed up. Suspects have been identified, investigated, and eliminated. The case has been examined by multiple law enforcement agencies. Private investigators have been involved. Forensic consultants have reviewed evidence. Cold case teams have taken fresh looks at the material. And despite all of this effort, despite all of this scrutiny, the case remains unsolved. Part of the challenge is the volume of information. In some cold cases, investigators have very little to work with. A few pieces of evidence. Limited witness statements. In this case, the opposite problem exists. There is an overwhelming amount of information. Thousands of pages of reports. Hundreds of photographs. Multiple forensic analyses. Countless interviews. Sorting through all of that material, determining what is relevant and what is not, identifying patterns and connections, is an enormous undertaking. Music. The intense public and media interest in the case has been both a help and a hindrance. On one hand, the publicity has kept the case in the public consciousness. Tips continue to come in decades later. People remain engaged and interested in seeing it solved. The attention has ensured that resources continue to be devoted to the investigation even after so many years. But the publicity has also created challenges. Misinformation has spread. Unfounded theories have taken on lives of their own. People who have no connection to the case have been subjected to public suspicion and accusation. The line between helpful public interest and harmful speculation has often been crossed. For the family members, the decades of unresolved investigation have been particularly difficult. They have lived under public scrutiny. They have had their lives examined in extraordinary detail. They have been subjected to suspicion and accusation. Even after official statements indicated that DNA evidence appeared to exclude them as suspects, the court of public opinion has not always been so kind. They have endured not only the loss at the center of this case but also nearly 3 decades of living with that loss in the public eye, with every anniversary bringing renewed media attention and renewed speculation. Music. The investigators who have worked this case over the years have also carried a heavy burden. They have devoted enormous amounts of time and energy to seeking justice. They have followed every lead. They have pursued every possibility. They have worked with the best forensic experts available. They have embraced new technologies as they have emerged. And despite all of that effort, despite all of that dedication, they have not yet been able to bring the case to resolution. For law enforcement professionals who are driven by a desire to solve cases and bring closure, this ongoing lack of resolution is deeply frustrating. But they continue to work. New investigators join the case as veterans retire. Technology continues to advance. Techniques that didn't exist 5 years ago are now standard practice. Methods that seemed like science fiction a decade ago are now routine investigative tools. And with each advancement, there is renewed hope that this will be the breakthrough. That this new technology, this new approach, will finally unlock the mystery that has persisted for so long. Music. The forensic genetic genealogy efforts currently underway represent the latest and potentially most promising approach. As of 2025, the technology has matured significantly from its first successful use in 2018. More people have submitted their DNA to genealogy databases, increasing the chances of finding genetic relatives. Genealogists have become more skilled at building family trees and interpreting genetic relationships. Law enforcement has developed better protocols for using the technology appropriately and effectively. All of these factors increase the probability of success. But success is not guaranteed. The DNA must be of sufficient quality and quantity for genealogical analysis. The databases must contain genetic relatives of the unknown individual. The genealogical research must successfully narrow down the possibilities. And traditional investigation must then confirm the identification. Each of these steps represents a potential point of failure. But each also represents a potential step toward finally answering the question that has lingered for 29 years: whose DNA is this? Music. If forensic genetic genealogy succeeds in identifying the source of the unknown male DNA, it will not automatically solve the case. It will answer one crucial question: who left this genetic material? But it may not answer how or when or why. If the identified individual has an innocent explanation for how their DNA came to be at those locations, if they can demonstrate that they had legitimate contact before the crime occurred, then the DNA evidence may still not point to a perpetrator. But at least investigators will be able to ask those questions. At least they will have a specific person to interview, to investigate, to either confirm or eliminate as connected to the crime. On the other hand, if the identified individual has no known connection to the victim or the residents, if they cannot explain how their DNA would have been present, if their background or history raises additional suspicions, then the DNA evidence combined with the identity it reveals could finally provide the breakthrough the case has needed. It could transform unknown genetic material into a specific suspect. It could turn a cold case into an active prosecution. It could finally bring resolution after 3 decades of questions. Music. The advancement of forensic science over these nearly 30 years illustrates how dramatically the field has changed. In 1996, DNA testing was still a relatively new tool. Forensic scientists were learning how to collect, preserve, and test biological evidence. The protocols and best practices that are now standard were still being developed. The databases that now contain millions of DNA profiles were just beginning to be established. The technology was revolutionary but still in its early stages. Today, DNA testing is faster, more sensitive, more specific, and more widely available than anyone in 1996 could have imagined. Testing that took weeks or months can now be completed in days or even hours. Samples that would have been too small or degraded to test with older technology can now yield detailed genetic profiles. Techniques like forensic genetic genealogy have opened entirely new investigative pathways. And the science continues to advance. What seems cutting edge in 2025 may seem primitive in another 10 or 20 years. Music. This case has been at the forefront of many of these advances. The 2008 Touch DNA testing was among the early applications of that technology in a major investigation. The current forensic genetic genealogy efforts represent the application of one of the newest tools in cold case investigation. The case has, in some ways, served as a testing ground for new forensic approaches, with each new technology bringing renewed hope and renewed investigation. But the case has also revealed the limitations of forensic science. DNA testing can tell us whose genetic material is present. It cannot always tell us how it got there, when it got there, or what it means. Handwriting analysis can provide opinions about authorship but cannot conclusively prove who wrote a document. Forensic pathology can determine cause of death but may not be able to determine every detail of how the crime was committed. Science is powerful, but it is not omniscient. It provides data, evidence, information. But interpreting that information within the context of a complex investigation still requires human judgment. Music. The investigators working this case in 2025 are benefiting from nearly 3 decades of accumulated knowledge. They have access to all of the evidence collected in 1996. They have the results of all the testing conducted over the years. They have reports from multiple investigative agencies and perspectives. They have consulted with experts across multiple forensic disciplines. And they have technologies available now that the original investigators could not have imagined. They are standing, in effect, on the shoulders of everyone who has worked the case before them. And they continue to work. They continue to test. They continue to analyze. They continue to pursue every possible lead. Because they know that somewhere in all of that accumulated evidence, all of that data, all of those test results, there may be the answer. The piece of information that, properly understood and properly contextualized, finally makes everything else make sense. The connection that has been there all along but that no one has yet recognized. The breakthrough that turns an unsolved case into a solved one. Music. For the public, this case has become emblematic of larger questions about justice, about forensic science, about how investigations are conducted and how they sometimes fail to reach resolution despite enormous effort. It has spawned countless documentaries, books, articles, and discussions. It has been analyzed and debated by professionals and amateurs alike. Everyone has a theory. Everyone has an opinion about what the evidence means and what should have been done differently. The case has become a kind of national Rorschach test, with people interpreting the evidence through the lens of their own perspectives and beliefs. But beyond all of the analysis and debate, beyond all of the theories and opinions, there are fundamental human realities at the center of this case. A life was lost. A family was shattered. A community was traumatized. And nearly 30 years later, there has been no accountability, no justice, no resolution. The investigation continues not as an academic exercise but as a search for answers on behalf of a victim who deserves justice and a family that deserves closure. Music. The DNA evidence that has been the focus of so much attention over these decades represents more than just genetic material. It represents hope. Hope that science will provide answers. Hope that technology will succeed where traditional investigation has not. Hope that the truth, whatever it is, will eventually be revealed. That unknown male DNA profile has been tested and retested, analyzed and reanalyzed, debated and discussed for 29 years. And it continues to be the most promising lead in the case. As forensic genetic genealogy efforts continue in 2025, there is cautious optimism that this technology may finally identify the source of that genetic material. Cautious because past hopes have been disappointed. Cautious because the process is complex and success is not guaranteed. But optimistic because the technology has proven successful in so many other cold cases. Optimistic because the science continues to improve. Optimistic because after 29 years, there is finally a realistic possibility that the question of whose DNA this is might actually be answered. Music. And if that question is answered, if the source of the DNA is identified, then the investigation will enter a new phase. A phase where the unknown becomes known. Where abstract genetic material becomes a specific human being with a history, a background, relationships, and a story. Whether that story includes involvement in this crime or explains innocent contact that has been misinterpreted for decades remains to be seen. But at least investigators will be able to ask the questions. At least they will have a direction to pursue. At least the decades of uncertainty about this particular piece of evidence may finally come to an end. The case that began on December 26, 1996, continues on January 27, 2025. Nearly 29 years have passed. Investigators have come and gone. Technologies have advanced beyond recognition. But the fundamental questions remain unanswered. What happened in that Boulder residence on that December night? Who is responsible? And will justice ever be achieved? Music. The DNA evidence holds a key. Perhaps the key. Genetic material that was collected almost 3 decades ago with the best technology available at that time. Genetic material that has been tested and retested as technology has advanced. Genetic material that has remained unknown, unmatched, unexplained for all of these years. But genetic material that, through the power of forensic genetic genealogy and the dedication of investigators who refuse to give up, might finally reveal its secrets. This is not just a story about DNA. It is a story about persistence. About how science and human determination combine in the search for truth. About how a case can remain active and investigated for decades because the people working on it believe that resolution is possible and necessary. About how advancing technology can provide new hope even when traditional investigation has reached apparent dead ends. Music. The investigators working this case today are using tools that didn't exist when the case began. They are applying knowledge that has been accumulated over 3 decades of investigation. They are pursuing leads that previous generations of investigators could not have pursued. And they are doing so with the understanding that this case has already consumed nearly 30 years and might consume many more before it is finally resolved. But they persist because the alternative, giving up, leaving the questions unanswered, allowing the case to fade into history without resolution, is unacceptable. For everyone who has followed this case over the years, for everyone who has wondered about the truth, for everyone who has hoped that justice would eventually be achieved, the DNA evidence represents something important. It represents the possibility that science will triumph. That truth will emerge. That the patient, methodical work of forensic analysis will eventually provide answers. It may not happen quickly. It may require technologies that don't even exist yet. But as long as that DNA evidence exists, as long as it can be tested and analyzed and compared, there is hope. Music. And so the investigation continues. In laboratories where forensic scientists examine genetic material with instruments of extraordinary precision. In genealogy databases where DNA profiles are compared against millions of others searching for family connections. In offices where investigators review decades of reports and evidence looking for patterns and connections. In conference rooms where cold case teams discuss new approaches and new possibilities. The work continues because the case demands it. Because the victim deserves it. Because justice requires it. December 26, 1996 was the day this case began. But it is not the day it will end. That day, whenever it comes, will be the day when the accumulated weight of evidence, investigation, and scientific advancement finally tips the balance from unknown to known. From unsolved to solved. From questions to answers. The DNA evidence that has been at the center of this case for 29 years may well be the key that finally opens that door. Music. This has been an examination of how DNA evidence has shaped one of America's most famous unsolved cases. How genetic material collected in 1996 has been tested, debated, and analyzed for nearly 3 decades. How advancing technology has provided new approaches to examining that evidence. and how the latest forensic techniques may finally identify the source of that genetic material and potentially break the case wide open. Before we close, I want to ask you to do something important. If this deep dive into forensic science and DNA evidence has shown you the power of modern investigative techniques, subscribe to Coldcase Crimelab right now. Hit that like button if you believe that persistence and science will ultimately solve this case. Share this video with anyone who cares about justice, about forensic science, about the cases that refuse to be forgotten. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on how DNA technology has changed criminal investigation. And turn on those notifications because we're going to continue following this case and others like it as new developments emerge. This is where we analyze the evidence, examine the science, and follow the truth wherever it leads. Thank you for being part of this investigation. Thank you for caring about justice. And thank you for supporting the kind of detailed, thoughtful analysis that cases like this deserve. Music. The story of this DNA evidence is not over. It continues in laboratories and databases and investigative offices. It continues in the minds of everyone who believes that truth can be found and justice can be achieved even after decades of uncertainty. It continues until the day when that unknown male DNA profile finally has a name attached to it. Until the day when the mystery that has consumed so much time, so much effort, so much hope, is finally solved. That day may be coming. The science suggests it is possible. The dedication of the investigators suggests they will not stop until it happens. And when it does, when the breakthrough finally comes, this case will transition from one of America's most famous unsolved mysteries to one of America's most dramatic examples of how persistence and advancing science can achieve justice even when it seems impossible. Until that day comes, the investigation continues. The testing continues. The hope continues. And the DNA evidence, collected so long ago, continues to hold the promise of answers that have eluded everyone for nearly 30 years. Music.